Imagine this. It's the height of World War II. You're an Allied commander. You've got the tanks. You've got the troops. You've got the will to fight. But you're facing a huge problem. How do you get a 30-ton Sherman tank from a ship in the ocean onto a hostile, enemy-defended beach? Traditional ports are heavily fortified, often destroyed. Bringing tanks ashore in pieces is too slow. The war effort is grinding against a logistical wall. This was the puzzle that haunted Winston Churchill. In a memo to his war cabinet, he demanded a solution. A vessel capable of landing tanks directly onto a beach, ready for immediate combat. It sounded like a fantasy. A ship that could cross the treacherous Atlantic, yet have a draft shallow enough to run right up to the shoreline. A vessel sturdy enough to carry heavy armor, but with a giant door on its bow that wouldn't compromise its structural integrity in rough seas. The very idea seemed to defy the fundamental principles of naval architecture. For centuries, ships were designed to keep water out, not to have a massive, intentional opening at the front. But in times of crisis, innovation is born out of necessity. In a remarkable feat of Anglo-American collaboration, naval architects and engineers huddled over blueprints, furiously sketching, calculating, and debating. The challenge was immense. The ship needed a flat bottom to beach itself, but a flat-bottomed ship is notoriously unstable in open water. It needed a ramp system that was both strong and lightweight. It needed to be mass-producible and fast. Early designs were dismissed. One idea involved attaching massive floats to a standard cargo ship, too clumsy. Another involved a complex system of cranes, too slow and vulnerable. Then, a breakthrough. The British team, led by the brilliant designer Sir Roland Baker, conceptualized a revolutionary design. It would have a unique ballast system. By flooding massive tanks with water, the ship would ride low and stable for ocean crossings. Upon approaching the beach, the crew would pump the water out, raising the ship's bow high in the water, allowing it to glide over shallows and ground itself firmly. This, combined with a large, watertight bow door and a deployable ramp, was the genesis of the landing ship. Tank, or as it would come to be affectionately known by its crew, the large, slow target. The design was finalized in late 1941, and the Americans, with their colossal industrial might, took the lead in construction. Shipyards that had never built anything like it were retooled. Higgins Industries in New Orleans, famous for its small landing craft, was one of the many that stepped up. Workers, many of whom were women entering the industrial workforce for the first time, worked around the clock. They built these ships in sections, sometimes inland, miles from any ocean. These massive steel pieces were then transported to coastal shipyards for final assembly. It was an unprecedented industrial mobilization. The first LST was launched in a matter of months, a testament to the urgency and ingenuity of the Allied war effort. From a desperate plea scrawled on a memo, a new kind of warship was born, a ship that didn't just carry the tools of war, but delivered them directly to the front door of the enemy. June 6, 1944. The grey dawn breaks over the stormy English Channel. The largest amphibious invasion force in human history is churning its way towards the Normandy coast. Among the destroyers, battleships, and cruisers are hundreds of strange, boxy-looking vessels. These are the LSTs, and they are the linchpin of the entire D-Day operation. Without them, the invasion would fail before it even began. As they approached the beaches codenamed Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the scene was pure chaos. The air was thick with smoke and the thunder of naval bombardments. German artillery shells rained down, sending plumes of water skyrocketing into the air. Through it all, the LSTs pushed forward. Their skippers, many of them young reservists, had to navigate treacherous underwater obstacles and withering machine gun fire. Their orders were simple and terrifying. Run the ship aground. On board, the tension was unbearable. Men from the US, Britain, Canada, and other allied nations checked their weapons, their faces grim. Packed tightly below deck in the cavernous tank bay were the steel beasts that would spearhead the assault. Sherman and Churchill tanks, armored bulldozers, trucks loaded with ammunition and supplies. The moment the LST crunched onto the sand, the immense bow doors swung open with a hydraulic groan, like the opening of a gate to hell. The ramp slammed down onto the beach, and with a roar of engines, the first tanks rolled out, their tracks biting into the wet sand and churning forward into the maelstrom of battle. This was the moment the LST was built for. It was a bridge, a floating roadway that connected the industrial heartland of the Allies directly to the battlefield. It delivered not just tanks, but also artillery pieces, ambulances, and thousands upon thousands of troops. After disgorging their cargo, they didn't retreat. The LSTs were transformed into floating hospitals. Medics set up makeshift operating theaters on the tank deck, working desperately to save the wounded who were being ferried back from the beach. Then, loaded with casualties, they would pull off the beach at high tide, return to England, reload with more men and equipment, and do it all over again. They were the relentless circulatory system of the invasion, pumping lifeblood into the Normandy beachhead. General Eisenhower himself would later state that the LST was one of the most crucial pieces of equipment to the Allied victory. On D-Day, it wasn't just a ship. It was the revolution that made the liberation of Europe possible. While the Allies were perfecting their amphibious doctrine, their primary adversary in the Pacific, Japan, was watching with a mixture of arrogance and ignorance. The Japanese military leadership, rooted in a tradition of decisive fleet battles and warrior spirit, fundamentally underestimated the importance of logistics. They believed the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean was their greatest defense. How could the Americans possibly project force across such a distance? Their strategy was to fortify key islands, creating a defensive perimeter that they believed was impenetrable. They would bleed the Americans dry in a series of bloody island battles, forcing them to a negotiated peace. Then came the newsreels. In darkened screening rooms in Tokyo, high-ranking Japanese officers watched footage of the Allied landings in Sicily and later Normandy. They saw it with their own eyes, not just a few tanks, but hundreds. not just landing on a pristine, captured port, but rolling directly out of the mouths of beached ships onto contested shores. The images were shocking, almost incomprehensible. Their strategic calculations began to crumble. Whispers would have filled the room. How is this possible? What kind of ship is that? How did they build so many? The sheer scale of the operation was bewildering. Japan, with its limited industrial capacity, struggled to replace its own naval losses. The idea that the Americans could produce over 1,000 of these massive, specialized ocean-going landing ships was a horrifying revelation. It meant that no island was safe. Every beach, no matter how remote or lightly defended, was now a potential invasion point. The Pacific Ocean was no longer a barrier. It was a highway for the American war machine. The LST completely upended Japanese defensive strategy. They had expected to fight the American fleet at sea. Instead, the Americans were simply bypassing their naval strongpoints and landing armies directly onto their island fortresses. From Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, the story was the same. The LSTs would appear on the horizon, an unstoppable tide of steel, and disgorge an overwhelming force of men and machines. The Japanese soldiers, often isolated and cut off from supply, could only fight to the last man. The LST was a psychological weapon as much as a logistical one. It was a symbol of an industrial power so vast, so inexhaustible, that it could simply build its way to victory. For the shocked observers in Tokyo, the sight of the LST wasn't just a new tactic. It was the writing on the wall. There's an old military axiom: amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. The story of the LST is the ultimate proof of this saying. In the grand narrative of World War II, we often focus on the heroic charges, the brilliant generals, and the decisive battles. But behind every one of those moments was a colossal, often unseen, logistical effort. And at the heart of that effort was this humble, ungainly ship. Picture it, a seemingly endless convoy of LSTs stretching to the horizon, their boxy silhouettes a stark contrast to the sleek lines of destroyers and carriers. This image, more than any other, represents the true source of Allied strength. It wasn't just about having more tanks or more planes. It was about the ability to deliver them where they were needed, when they were needed. The LST was the gear that connected the factory to the front line. It carried the fuel that kept the tanks running, the shells that kept the artillery firing, the rations that kept the soldiers fighting, and the field hospitals that gave them a chance to survive. Over 1,000 LSTs were built during the war, a staggering number. They served in every major theater, from the freezing waters of the Aleutian Islands to the tropical heat of the South Pacific, from the beaches of Normandy to the riverbanks of the Rhine. They were crewed by brave men who endured terrible conditions, cramped quarters, relentless seas, and the constant threat of enemy attack. They called their ships large, slow targets, with a gallows humor that masked the very real dangers they faced. Yet they sailed on, the unsung workhorses of the fleet. The LST didn't just win battles. It changed the very nature of warfare. It proved that with overwhelming logistical superiority A nation could project its power across any ocean and onto any shore. It was a floating factory, a mobile port, and a bridge of steel, all in one. When the war was over and the history books were written, the glory might have gone to the fighters and the bombers. But the victory itself was carried on the flat-bottomed hull of the landing ship, tank. It remains one of history's greatest reminders that wars are ultimately won not just by courage, but by cranes, by assembly lines, and by the relentless, grinding power of logistics. How did a nation, still reeling from the Great Depression and just entering the largest conflict in human history, pull off such a miracle? The answer lies not in a single shipyard, but across the entire country. The challenge was so massive that traditional coastal shipyards were already at full capacity building destroyers, carriers, and battleships. The Navy needed a new solution, and they found it in the most unlikely of places, America's heartland. They turned to the industrial might of the Midwest, to the steel mills and fabrication plants that dotted the riverbanks of the Ohio and the Mississippi. These were places that had never built a ship before. They were masters of bridges, buildings, and boilers, but ocean-going vessels. It was unheard of. Yet these inland shipyards rose to the occasion. Places like Evansville, Indiana, Seneca, Illinois, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, suddenly became bustling hubs of naval construction, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. The secret weapon was a revolutionary concept, prefabrication. Think of it like a giant nationwide assembly line. Instead of building a ship from the keel up in one location, components were manufactured all across the country. Car factories in Michigan stopped making automobiles and started stamping out bulkheads and deck plates. Bridge-building companies in Pennsylvania fabricated massive hull sections. These pieces, some weighing many tons, were then loaded onto trains and barges and shipped to the inland shipyards for final assembly. It was a logistical masterpiece. At these riverside yards, a new kind of assembly line was created. Imagine massive, pre-built sections arriving, ready to be welded together. It was like building with colossal Lego bricks. Cranes would lift entire bow sections or engine rooms into place, and teams of welders would swarm to join them. This modular approach dramatically slashed construction time. What would normally take months was now being done in weeks, and sometimes even days. The process was so refined that at peak production, a brand new 328-foot-long LST was being launched every 3 to 4 days from a single yard. And who were the people making this happen? It was an army of ordinary citizens turned industrial heroes. With so many men serving overseas, the call went out to everyone else. Women, famously represented by the Rosie the Riveter ideal, stepped up in unprecedented numbers. They weren't just riveting. They were welders, electricians, and crane operators. They were called Winnie the Welders in the shipyards. Men who were too old or unfit for combat brought their lifetime of skills to the production line. It was a true national effort, a melting pot of Americans from all walks of life, working side by side around the clock, united by a common purpose. The design of the LST itself was a work of genius, born out of necessity. The British, after the disastrous retreat from Dunkirk, knew they needed a way to land heavy equipment directly onto enemy shores without relying on established ports, which would be heavily defended. They needed a ship that could cross an ocean and then run itself right up onto a beach. The result was the LST landing ship tank. These weren't beautiful vessels. They were utilitarian, boxy, and slow, earning them the affectionate but telling nickname, Large, Slow Target. But their design was brilliant. They had a flat bottom that allowed them to get close to shore and a massive bow door with a ramp. This allowed tanks, trucks, and artillery to roll directly from the ship's cavernous tank deck onto the beach, delivering the heavy firepower needed to secure a foothold. They could carry over 2,000 tons of cargo, or an entire company of infantry, or a mix of tanks and vehicles. They were the ultimate delivery service for amphibious invasions, the key that would unlock Fortress Europe. Once these ships were assembled in the heartland, they began an incredible journey. They sailed down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, navigating the winding waterways towards the Gulf of Mexico. For many of the newly minted sailors on board, this was their first time at sea. A trial run on America's great rivers before facing the open ocean. From New Orleans, they sailed to coastal ports to be fitted out with final equipment and weaponry before joining convoys headed for the war zones in Europe and the Pacific. It was a journey of 1,000 miles before their real mission even began. From the shores of Sicily and the beaches of Anzio to the D-Day landings in Normandy, the LSTs were there. They were indispensable. On D-Day alone, a massive flotilla of these ships delivered the bulk of the initial armored divisions to Utah and Omaha beaches. They didn't just drop off their cargo and leave. They became lifelines. They returned to the beaches again and again, bringing reinforcements, ammunition, and food. On their return trips to England, they transformed into floating hospitals, carrying the wounded back to safety. Their versatility was their greatest strength. The numbers are simply staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards, both coastal and inland, produced an unbelievable 1,051 LSTs. This industrial tidal wave completely overwhelmed the Axis powers. They simply could not comprehend or compete with this level of production. Winston Churchill himself called the LST the ship that won the war, acknowledging that without this vast fleet, the large-scale invasions in both Europe and the Pacific would have been impossible. So, the next time you think about the great feats of the Second World War, remember the story of the LSTs. It's a testament not just to military strategy, but to the power of innovation, logistics, and the unyielding spirit of a nation united. It's the story of how factories that once made cars built a fleet, how rivers became highways to war, and how ordinary people achieved the extraordinary building nearly a ship a day to help secure victory. Imagine a dimly lit room deep within the heart of the Japanese Naval Command. Maps cover the walls, and strategy boards are littered with ship models. This is where an empire, confident in its might, planned to dominate the Pacific. In the early days of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a fearsome sight. The Kido Butai, the carrier strike force, was the most powerful in the world. Ships like the Akagi, Kaga, and the mighty Yamato-class battleships seemed invincible. Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines. Victory after victory fueled a national sense of destiny. The sun on their flag seemed to rise higher with each conquest. To many admirals, the war plan was unfolding perfectly. They had struck a decisive blow and believed they had crippled the American will to fight. But across the vast Pacific, a different kind of war was being waged. Not on the high seas, but in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, and the steel mills of Pennsylvania. The United States, a nation shaken but not broken, was awakening. It was what Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had feared most. He had famously warned, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." That terrible resolve was taking shape on endless production lines. While Japan struggled to replace a single lost aircraft carrier, the U.S. was building them by the dozen. Essex-class carriers, Hellcat fighters, Sherman tanks, they poured out of American factories in numbers that defied belief. An intelligence report lands on an admiral's desk. He reads it, then reads it again. The numbers are staggering. Impossible. The U.S. isn't just replacing its losses. It's building a force larger than anything the world has ever seen. This is the first cold dread, the initial whisper of doubt. It's not a single battle. It's a war of attrition they cannot possibly win. Then comes the Battle of Midway, June 1942. It was supposed to be the final, decisive blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Instead, in the span of just 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's best carriers, Kagi, Kaga, and Soyuwa, turned into blazing inferno. A fourth, the Hiryu, would follow them to the bottom of the sea. For the admirals in that command room, watching the reports come in, this was the turning point. It wasn't just the loss of ships. It was the loss of their most experienced pilots, the elite core of their naval aviation, which could never be replaced. The tide had turned. The hunter had become the hunted. From that moment on, the war became a desperate struggle for survival. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Philippines. Each battle was a brutal, grinding fight. On the bridges of their ships, Japanese commanders watched as a new and terrifying American weapon came to dominate the battlefield: radar. Their fleets, once able to maneuver under the cover of darkness or bad weather, were now relentlessly tracked. Radar screens on American ships blinked with contacts, guiding shells and torpedoes with deadly accuracy through the blackest night. The Battle of the Philippine Sea became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots, better trained and in superior aircraft, decimated what was left of Japan's carrier air power. The sinking of the Musashi, the Yamato's sister ship, by waves of carrier planes, proved that the era of the battleship was truly over. Each loss was another nail in the coffin. The admirals knew. They might not have said it aloud in strategy meetings, but they knew. They saw it in the casualty reports, in the shrinking fuel reserves, and in the sheer, overwhelming numbers of the enemy. The war was no longer about victory. It was about how it would end. The final, devastating moments came not at sea, but from the sky. In August 1945, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were subjected to a new kind of weapon, one that could unleash the power of the sun. The news of this unimaginable destruction was the final, undeniable confirmation. There was no strategy, no countermeasure, no spiritual will that could stand against such power. The war was over. In the end, we see an admiral, perhaps Yamamoto himself in our imagination, or perhaps one of his successors who lived to see the end. He stands not in a command room, but on a quiet shore, looking out at the calm ocean. The sun sets on the horizon, the same sun that adorns his nation's flag. The war is lost. The empire is gone. There is only the vast, indifferent sea, and the silence that follows the storm. He understood in that moment of profound stillness that the war was lost, not in the final battle, but in the countless moments that led to it, in the factories on the radar screens, and in the staggering, undeniable numbers on a piece of paper. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.